everybody. Welcome to our final CLIL module, Module 4, Assessment. As usual, let's take a look at our learning aims for this session. Please take a moment to read the screen. Okay, let's start with a little bit of theory. But before we talk about theory, I'd like you to look at my screen and consider these two questions for a moment. Assessment is an essential condition for improvement, and learning takes place in the moment of feedback. I'm really interested to know if you agree with these two statements, and this is going to be one of our teacher tasks at the end of the unit. So just make a note of those questions, and as we watch videos and as we talk and as we explore the area, I'd be really interested if you could tell me what you think in the forum. Remember, you don't have to write an essay or a paragraph. It can just be a few lines or a few keywords. Okay, so a little bit of theory. Why assess our CLIL students? Well, basically, we need to know what they know and also what they don't know and help them to fill in any gaps. Think about how you were assessed at school as a child. I went to school a very, very long time ago, and I remember my exams, which were always in the summer, and which included content, material that I hadn't seen since September, since the school had started. That was my experience, and it wasn't a particularly good one. We had 9 months of lessons with a final exam that included things that we'd actually not touched for 8 of those months. So we might study something in September and October, and we wouldn't see it again until our exams in June. Or what might happen is in May, the teacher would suddenly realize that we were near the end of term, and we would suddenly start to do a lot of material in the last few weeks of term to prepare us for the exam. These days, it doesn't work like that, hopefully, and CLIL especially doesn't work that way. If you look back on the previous units, we'll remember that CLIL's all about recycling, retrieval, working on the cyclical approach, going back to things, keeping things fresh, keeping students engaged, which unfortunately, a lot of official exams don't always do. We tend to talk about assessment broadly in two ways: summative assessment and formative assessment. Summative assessment is focused more on the achievement of students at a specific point in time, and quite often it results in a grade, a numerical grade or a letter grade, or maybe just a pass or fail. As such, tests are always summative, traditional tests that we do in the classroom, as are official examinations and external qualifications. They're a kind of snapshot about what the student knows or can produce under exam conditions at a certain moment. Formative assessment is very different. It tends to be a more diagnostic way of assessment. It might include providing feedback to students if they're on the right track. It might include improving something that the student's done under test conditions. For example, re-editing, redrafting, reformulating. Excuse me. Often we tend to do formative assessment in a very holistic way. We have a feeling about a student or a student's work. So we feel that a student's doing well or not. It's not quite enough, however, is it? We have to make sure that our criteria for assessment in any kind of subject is transparent, not just for students, but for parents and for the institution itself. So we have to make sure we're very clear and maybe not be so vague, which we might be sometimes. As usual, a short video can explain this much more clearly than I can. So I'm going to ask you to watch a very short 2-minute video, and don't forget our 2 questions. Have a look at these again. our two questions, our two statements. Look at these again and let's watch a short video on formative and summative assessment. Let's go. So it would seem from the video and from the research that formative assessment is probably CLIL's more natural habitat. In education generally, we're moving away from a product approach towards a more process method of education. And CLIL is definitely towards the formative end of the spectrum. CLIL teachers normally recognize this, which is why there is so much feedback internally in CLIL lessons and why there is so much recycling and so much retrieval and representation and repackaging of content. However, what else do we need to consider about assessment? For assessment to be positive, it must fulfill the following criteria. It must be reliable. Do our exams behave consistently and fairly? Are the conditions in which the students do an assessment fair for everybody? Does it depend on the weather? Does it depend on the classroom? Does it depend on the person carrying out the assignment? Do students get different marks or grades with different teachers in different classrooms under different conditions? A test or assessment must also be valid. Are the exams or assessments an authentic test of what the students know? What are we actually testing? Do we really know? And more importantly, do our students know what we're testing, especially in CLIL subjects? Do the students think that they're being tested on accuracy of grammar, accuracy of vocabulary, rather than being able to understand a concept? Are they worried about spelling when all we really want them to do is label a picture? We've got to make sure it's valid, that everybody knows what's being assessed. Is it practical as well? In schools these days, our resources are often quite limited at times. So we've got to make sure that our assessments really do meet learners' needs. Is it practical? It might be a great idea to want to have the students make a model of X, Y, and Z, or go into the street and interview a group of people, but it might not actually be practical. So we have to be realistic about what we can do. We also have to think about the impact any assessment might have. Do our assessments have a positive effect on teaching and learning? For example, washback. Washback concerns the impact of tests and assessments on materials, teachers, and the learners. Learning isn't static and nor is teaching, so assessment should have a positive effect on what the teacher does in the classroom, what he or she needs to adjust. We say that positive washback results when a testing procedure or the results of a testing procedure encourages good teaching practice. For example, a teacher changes or adjusts what they do in the classroom because they realize that it doesn't work or it could be improved. Excuse me. Some teachers set tests that many students fail. Personally, and I think the research backs me up on this, if a high percentage of students are regularly failing a test or an assessment, there's something wrong with the teaching there. It's not the students, it's the teaching. And quite often we see the results of our teaching in the feedback we get from exams or tests or assessments. So, what do we have to be careful about? What do we have to consider when we're assessing in CLIL? Well, first of all, what do we assess? Are we going to assess content or are we going to assess language? In what language are we going to assess? In what language is the student going to communicate? And if we do assess in English, how do we minimize the effect of language errors on the assessment? David Marsh, the educator and linguist who has done a lot of research into CLIL and CLIL techniques, especially in assessment, talks about language demand. We have to be very careful with summative assessment with CLIL because quite often the language demand can be very heavy. We use exams that need a very high level of CALP for the students to understand or produce correct answers. And remember, there's a very big difference between BICS and CALP for quite a long time. So what we need to do is reduce the language that the students need to produce in an exam, but more about that later. In CLIL, we don't just assess at the end of a teaching unit, we assess constantly throughout the lesson. We have our initial evaluations, our visible thinking routines that show us what the students know, gaps in their knowledge. We deal with assessment during the learning process. We're constantly recycling and checking throughout the lesson. If we think our students haven't understood anything, we're not afraid to say, stop, let's go back. In module 2, we talked about constraints of time and the pace of the lesson. I have 10 minutes left and I need to do X, Y, and Z. If it's not working, then we leave X, Y, and Z for another day. Maybe we have to go back to ABC. It all depends. We're very responsive to our students. So, content or language? Content is normally the main focus, but any language we use should be in context. Remember what David Marsh says about the language demand. A very open question, for example, write everything you know about the solar system. This is a really complex task. Write everything you know about. What we're doing here is we're actually asking the students to do something that a native speaker would find quite difficult. We can't say, write everything you know about. We say something like, write 3 things about, or tell us 5 reasons why, or tell us 2 positive things or negative things that you know about the subject. So it's all about the content and making the language easier or making the language scaffolded. I'm going to show you a very short video now that will talk a little bit more about the language aspect of CLIL. I'd like you to watch it and keep in mind our two questions from the beginning of the session. Bear those in mind, and if you want to take notes about any main takeaways, please do.
Created using power.
I have three main takeaways from that very short video. My first takeaway is about a language clinic. I think this is a fabulous idea, and it's something I've started doing a lot in my own CLIL lessons. Language clinics where we look at common errors that the students make without naming any names, and we actually focus on them specifically. It's not just enough to give a language frame, present the frame, and then not work on it again. Focus on specific errors that the students make in speaking or in writing and actually improve them, because sometimes we can get so carried away with content that we actually forget that we do need a certain amount of accuracy. Yeah, so I like the language clinic idea. I also really like the idea about clarity. Clarity in the sense that the students know what's being assessed and what's being expected for them. They know what content they're going to have to produce, and they also know what language they're going to have to produce. We're realistic. We don't expect the students to produce very, very complicated chunks of language when we haven't taught them that. So everyone goes into an assessment or test or evaluation or exam or whatever we want to call it, but everyone goes into that situation, which can produce quite a lot of anxiety for students and also for teachers sometimes. with a clear idea of what is going to be demanded of them. My third takeaway is something that I find really interesting, especially with all the research about translanguaging. It's about letting the students do the exam in their L1, in their own language rather than English. Translanguaging debate isn't quite sure at the moment. They don't have a very strong position. But personally, I come down on the side of L2, of the foreign language, because I think I do need to push my students to a certain extent. I do need to let them produce language and show me that they can produce it. Obviously, with lower level learners or in special circumstances, I'm not very strict on that. But I do make it very clear that, okay, this is an assessment situation and I want you to use English. Doesn't have to be 100% accurate. I'm not expecting high levels of CALP, but I am asking for the language to be produced. So they're my three main takeaways. I'm quite interested in what your three might be, and also if you've found any answers to those two questions I posed. So let's look at tasks where the students need less language, where they can show what they know in English in the foreign language by completing grids, drawing diagrams, reading comprehension, true or false statements, matching information, and correcting wrong facts. A lot of this can be illustrated very, very clearly with a nice visual organizer, something pictorial, something very helpful. This again is a form of scaffolding. Some teachers think that scaffolding is cheating, but I can assure you it's not. Scaffolding is still a system of support that students still might need in an assessment situation. Remember, the gap between BICS and CALP is difficult and big, so we can't expect the students to give us very, very high complex language if we've not given them enough exposure to it. We do have to be careful, though, with some of these tasks, because what we want to avoid is word spotting. If you're familiar with the phrase word spotting, it means when students see a word, recognize it, and jump on it without really understanding the meaning. It tends to happen in exercises where the students get the correct answer by a process of elimination. Okay, it's not B and it's not D, so it must be C. Okay, there's very little cognition going on there. There's very little thought. Sometimes the students get the right answer by default. So we've established that for CLIL, if the students are lacking in language, then we need to choose tasks where they don't have to produce a lot of it themselves, but they still need to focus on content. Anything that's visual, a presentation linked to visuals, anything that helps the student to show their thinking or to show a process of thinking is also really useful.